Welcome to Afrisight Forum. Today, we are breaking down one of the most consequential judicial decisions in recent Nigerian legal history, the Court of Appeal's judgment in the case involving Mazi Nnamdi Kanu, the detained leader of the indigenous people of Biafra. This is not a matter of sentiment. This is not a matter of politics. This is a matter of law, and the law has spoken clearly. If you have been following this case, or if you are only just hearing about it, stay with us. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what the court decided, what it means in law, and what comes next. Segment 1. The foundation, unlawful rendition. At the heart of this appellate proceeding was a question that the lower court had deliberately avoided confronting. Was the manner in which Nnamdi Kanu was returned to Nigeria lawful? To answer that question properly, we need to go back to 2021. Kanu had been living outside Nigeria since 2017, when he jumped bail and fled the country while his first trial was ongoing. He eventually settled in the United Kingdom, where he held British citizenship. In June 2021, he traveled to Kenya. What happened next became the subject of intense legal dispute. Kanu was forcibly brought back to Nigeria from Nairobi under circumstances that his legal team described from the outset as a covert abduction, an operation conducted entirely outside any formal extradition framework. The federal government never initiated extradition proceedings. No bilateral treaty between Nigeria and Kenya was invoked. No legal request was made to Kenyan authorities through proper diplomatic channels. No court in Kenya authorized his transfer. Kanu simply disappeared from Nairobi and reappeared days later in the custody of the Department of State Services in Abuja. The federal government did not deny that he was brought back without extradition. What they argued was that this did not matter, that once he was physically present before a Nigerian court, the court had jurisdiction to try him regardless of how he got there. The Court of Appeal examined this sequence of events with the thoroughness that the trial court failed to apply. After reviewing the full record of proceedings and hearing submissions from both parties, the appellate court reached an unambiguous conclusion. What occurred was an unlawful rendition. This was not a minor procedural complaint. Extradition, the formal process by which one state surrenders a person to another, is governed by clear legal rules designed to protect individual rights and constrain state power. Those rules exist precisely to prevent governments from using covert operations to bypass judicial oversight. They were not followed in this case. The court held that this breach was not a technical defect capable of being cured at a later stage. It was a fundamental violation that struck at the very root of the case. In law, the legitimacy of criminal proceedings depends on the legitimacy of the process that brought the defendant before the court. If that process is unlawful, everything built upon it is compromised. The Court of Appeal held precisely this. Once the rendition is found to be unlawful, all that follows is infected. The foundation had collapsed before a single charge was read. Segment 2. Jurisdiction. The trial court's critical error. The appellate court then turned its attention to how the Federal High Court had handled this foundational challenge, and what it found was deeply troubling. Justice James Omotosho had proceeded on the assumption that once Kanu was physically present before the court, questions about how he came to be there were secondary matters that could be set aside in the interest of proceeding with the substantive charges. This is a position that some legal systems have entertained in the past. The Court of Appeal rejected it outright and in clear terms. Jurisdiction, the appellate court clarified, is not merely about physical presence. A defendant standing in the dock does not, by that fact alone, vest a court with jurisdiction. Jurisdiction also requires that the process by which the defendant was brought before the court was itself lawful. Where that process is fundamentally flawed, the court cannot proceed as if nothing happened and cannot cure the defect simply by moving forward. The trial court had also dismissed preliminary objections raised by the defense at various stages of the proceedings, objections that went directly to the issues of unlawful rendition and procedural irregularity. The Court of Appeal found that these objections had not been adequately addressed. Rather than confront the serious legal questions they raised, the lower court had effectively treated the unlawful rendition as a separate matter, entirely disconnected from the validity of the trial itself. The appellate court refused to sustain that separation. It held that where a violation directly and fundamentally affects the legitimacy of a trial, It cannot be cordoned off and treated in isolation from the substantive proceedings. The integrity of the judicial process must be preserved at every stage, from the moment of apprehension to the moment of final judgment. A court that overlooks how a man was brought before it cannot claim to be administering justice impartially. Segment 3. The verdict, conviction quashed. Based on its findings, the Court of Appeal reached a decisive and far-reaching conclusion. The proceedings at the Federal High Court were fundamentally defective. The defects were not curable. They were so pervasive that they infected the entire trial from its very beginning. There was no valid legal foundation upon which the conviction could stand. The court formally quashed the conviction. It is important that we understand precisely what this means in law, because the word is sometimes used loosely in public discourse. To quash a conviction is not to reduce a sentence. It is not to order a retrial. It is not to suspend judgment pending further review. It is to nullify the judgment entirely, to treat it as having no legal effect whatsoever from the moment it was originally entered. The sentence imposed by Justice Omotosho, the ancillary penalties, every legal consequence attached to that conviction, all of it collapsed the moment the appellate court delivered its order. Following the quashing of the conviction, the Court of Appeal turned to the question of custody. At the time of the ruling, Nnamdi Kanu remained in detention. The appellate court addressed whether there was any remaining lawful basis to keep him there. It held that in the absence of a valid conviction or a lawful subsisting remand order, continued detention had absolutely no legal justification. The court, therefore, ordered the immediate release of Nnamdi Kanu from custody. The release order was described as self-executing in nature, meaning it took effect upon delivery of the judgment and did not require further administrative processing or ministerial approval before it became operative. In addition to the release order, the court awarded substantial financial compensation against the federal government of Nigeria. 500 million naira was awarded in respect of the unlawful rendition. A further 200 million naira was awarded for the unlawful conviction and the period of sentencing that followed. These awards created a binding financial obligation on the state, enforceable through available legal mechanisms, including formal demand and court-directed enforcement proceedings where necessary. Segment 4. What happens next day? Court of Appeal judgment, significant as it is, does not always represent the final word. Under the Nigerian judicial hierarchy, either party may challenge the decision before the Supreme Court of Nigeria, which sits as the highest court in the land on matters of this nature. If the federal government elects to appeal, it may simultaneously apply for a stay of execution, a court order that temporarily suspends the enforcement of the appellate judgment pending the Supreme Court's determination. This would affect the release order, the compensation awards, and any other operative directives issued by the Court of Appeal. However, a stay of execution is never granted automatically. An applicant must satisfy strict legal conditions before a court will suspend its own judgment or that of a lower court. In the absence of a granted stay, every order issued by the Court of Appeal remains fully binding and immediately enforceable. The Correctional Service, the Department of State Services, and the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation are all required to comply without delay. It is equally important to understand what this judgment does not do. It does not permanently close the door on all legal proceedings against Nnamdi Kanu. What the court established is that any future prosecution, should the state choose to pursue one, must be initiated and conducted on an entirely lawful foundation. The findings on unlawful rendition and the procedural defects identified in the judgment will remain part of the permanent judicial record unless they are specifically overturned by the Supreme Court. Any fresh attempt to prosecute must confront those findings head-on. The court was deliberate in emphasizing that its decision rested exclusively on legal principles, on the constitutional protections of personal liberty, the right to fair hearing, and the guarantee of due process. It made no pronouncement on the merits of the underlying allegations against Kanu. Its role was confined to determining whether the process by which he was tried complied with the law. It determined, without ambiguity, that it did not. Outro: the Court of Appeal has spoken. Whether one supports Nnamdi Kanu or firmly opposes everything he represents, the legal message of this judgment reaches far beyond any one individual. It is a statement about the limits of state power. It is a reminder that in a constitutional democracy, the government is not above the law, not even when it believes the ends justify the means. The rule of law is not a convenience to be invoked when it favors the state and quietly discarded when it does not. It is a standard that binds the government and the governed alike. What happens next, whether the state complies, whether an appeal is filed, whether the Supreme Court is called upon to speak, we will be here to report it and analyze it.